Worries on the one side of resource nationalism, as governments seek to up their take and companies involved are worried about what this might entail. On the other side, governments are worried about the way in which their resources are going to be used, exploited, and whether or not those benefits are going to be completely externalized and what they are going to be able to retain themselves. Fortunately, there is good practice and there are lessons to be learned and there is good knowledge to be shared on what is the best way of doing this, what is the best way of unlocking the sector, and where does that middle ground sit. I'm delighted that we've got a panel here today who are going to be perhaps in an hour and a half not able to fully resolve some of these issues, but I feel confident that we will be able to make a substantial and valuable contribution to this debate. And I know that there are others here in the audience who are also highly expert and will surely come in during the conversation. So you've got the questions in front of you that we're looking to ask. What are the key trends in mining? How should strategic minerals be defined? What is the impact of rare earth demand? What are the optimal policies, regulations, and legislative frameworks for attracting investment? Questions around transparency. And then important issues such as what is being done to improve environmental sustainability in the mining sector, and how are companies working with communities in this issue? And to answer these questions, we have a balanced panel representing business, people involved in policy making, people with long-term experience within the industry, and people who are from the civil society perspectives as well. So we're going to start with a video from Sheila Kama, who's a non-executive director at Tullow Oil, but she was previously the CEO of De Beers Botswana and has been involved in international organizations working on the mining industry at both the World Bank and the African Development Bank. Sadly, she wasn't able to join us because of the change of date, but we do have a short video from her. You will also find a much longer video of about 20 minutes long is shared on the link on your agendas. So the issues in the video we're about to see, she's going to talk about some of the issues around mining policy and the involvement of countries such as China in the mining industry here in Africa and in Zambia in particular. But she's also recorded important messages around ESG issues, as well as the decolonization of the African mining industry. So if you're interested in those issues, please do go and look at the video online. But we'll start now. Yusuf, if we're ready, we'll have that video from the messages that Sheila wishes to share.
I think it's fair to say that when it comes to relationships between mining companies and host governments in Africa, the single most, I think, perhaps reliable description of those relationships that they're complex. They're often oversimplified, at least in my opinion, but they are complex. But it also is often these relationships are seen as sort of being uniform, that you can speak about relations across the continent, across countries and across countries. But, you know, the way I see them is that even at that level, they differ. So I think it's good to just have that as an important point of departure. Having said that, I think an important characteristic is that there's a lot of misunderstanding between the governments and the companies. And this misunderstanding, in my view, stems from several factors. First of all, investors fundamentally come from a different perspective. They operate in a different environment. They answer to different constituents. And their sense of what is successful and what is not successful differs from that of government. Their sense of what is value also differs from that of governments. Their sense of the pace at which things should move also differs from that of government. So I think this creates a lot of misunderstanding. The other thing that characterizes these relationships is that they operate under a lot of pressure. Both have a lot of pressure put onto them, but by different people and for different reasons. So investors are under pressure from the financiers to deliver a return on the investment that they make on the projects. They are also under pressure from those that own them, the shareholders, to provide a return on the investment that they have made. For that matter, if they come from what is called the global north, they also now increasingly are under pressure from NGOs who are expecting a certain type of behavior out of them. They are under pressure from the laws that are enacted in those countries that nevertheless police them even when they operate in Africa and not necessarily in Europe or the United States. The Dodd-Frank Act is a case in point, but there are laws also in the United Kingdom on reporting and in Europe. So these expectations define the environment in which they operate. On the side of government has huge expectations. First of all, as the government of the day, they campaign on certain promises. As a result, that gives rise to expectations. There's a very profound and legitimate sense of ownership on the part of citizens with respect to mineral resources. And with that brings expectations to benefit from the exploitation of these resources. The result of which is that that environment can be pretty tense. And so when I think about what the main characteristics of this environment are, those are the few issues, among others, that come to mind. Naturally, there's a lot of talk about China, and it is understandable. China is a giant. China has altered the diplomatic structure of the world. China has altered the trade structure, both in industrial, consumer goods, finance, and anything that you can think of. And so it's unthinkable China will not impact Africa's mineral history going forward. And to your question, the real issue is how will this manifest itself? So let me be clear. I do not look at China any differently. And the notion that somehow China's interest differs from those of former colonial masters, in my view, is false. The colonial masters came to Africa because they wanted to nurture their interest. Let me be clear, that is exactly the same reason why China is here. The only question we should ask is that now that we have had colonial masters coming from Europe and to a limited extent the United States, how does China's presence change things such that we can exercise leverage? And if so, how do we exercise that leverage? That is the only relevant question that, in my view, African governments ought to ask themselves. The assumption that China might solve problems created by others in the past simply is not correct. So when I think of China, I think, what opportunities does China present such that Africa can now engage China as a non-former colonial entity in a way that resets the environment in which Africa's minerals are exploited? So far, I have not seen that question being sufficiently put center stage. I have not seen African governments proactively answering that question. On the contrary, what I see, which is very much akin to what happened during the Scramble for Africa, is that it is China that is taking the initiative and coming to Africa with a strategy that is distinctly Chinese, meant to give Chinese the upper hand, not just in relation to Africa, but for that matter, in the geopolitics of minerals all over the world. Here are a few examples. One, a Chinese firm just paid about, I think, 300 million US dollars to buy a Zimbabwe lithium company. That was an initiative by a Chinese in Zimbabwe, and not by a Zimbabwe authority going to China and saying, we offer you this and these are our terms. That was China coming and saying, I want this and these are my terms. The same has happened in the DRC with cobalt. China now accounts for about 70% of the entire production of what are called critical minerals, in part thanks to the deals that China has made with the governments of the DRC. I don't see a difference. I just see that the minerals are going east and not north. But here and now, Africa is still producing the raw materials. Here and now, Africa is still having the minerals exported whole. Here and now, the Chinese firms in Zambia have not set up processing plants and manufacturing plants. So if this conversation is going to change, my sense is that it's going to be the African leaders to change it. And here and now, I don't see that. So China will change the geopolitics of the world. Africa will not. Africa will once again watch and be, if you wish, like the playground on which everybody else plays while we remain the audience. I think it's a great tragedy, if you ask me. There's been enough lessons that if with a little goodwill, we can turn this around. But I have to say, with a hand on my heart, with all the respect I have for my principles, I don't see it.
Okay, so that's, I think, a useful overview for us to start the discussion here, sent in from Sheila Kama, who again sends her apologies. Now, as we turn now to start thinking about key issues within the policy domain and the regulatory environment on the continent, I can think of few better people qualified to talk about such an issue than our next speaker, Peter Leon. Peter is a partner and the global chair of the African group at Herbert Smith Freehills. He said, Peter is one of the world's preeminent mining lawyers according to the international who's who of mining lawyers. Now, I don't think it's just the international who's who of mining lawyers that recognizes this. I think it's anyone who's ever attended a mining indaba or a mining event on the continent. So I'm delighted to welcome Peter to the stage, who will be sharing with us some ideas about regulation and examples from elsewhere of what can be learned and shared. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Chris, for those very warm and generous words and welcoming remarks. And I was very taken by what Sheila Kama said, whom I know have the pleasure of knowing very well, because the way, and I'm not going to talk about this afternoon, but maybe we come up in the questions. One of the things that struck me, working as I have in a number of African mining jurisdictions, is the complexity of relationships between mining companies and host states, and indeed communities. And that's one of the key issues I think mining companies have to grapple with in this era of ESG and pressure on stakeholder relationships. But I'm going to talk about strategic minerals this afternoon, bearing in mind that we're sitting in Lusaka in terms of the impact and importance of strategic minerals for Zambia, because I think that is perhaps something you want to hear about, given the importance of mining to the Zambian economy. I think it's quite significant that during the election campaign that President Hichilema won last August, he talked about getting Zambia to ensure it had speedy economic growth and development and a target economic growth of 10%. And in that regard, the President and the UPND, his party, have undertaken to increase copper production in this country from 800,000 tons at the moment to 3 million tons in the next 10 years. That's a very, very ambitious target. But to put it in context, I mean, mining is absolutely front and center of this economy. It accounts for 10% of GDP, 70% of foreign exchange earnings, 30% of government revenue, and 8% of formal employment. Obviously, the government recognizes this, but the challenge here, and the Zambian government, the preceding administration, the Lungu administration, had a number of fairly unpleasant tangles with the mining industry, both with Vedanta and with Glencore. So the challenge is, how does the government go about doing this? But I think it has a particularly important or salient issue here, and that is the whole issue of the green energy transition, which I think Chris alluded to. Because what Zambia has is the second biggest set of reserves of copper and cobalt on the African continent after the DRC. And Sheila mentioned the DRC and Chinese investment in the DRC, but copper and cobalt are absolutely key strategic metals for the green energy transition. But in Zambia, the issue is, while copper is relatively well exploited, cobalt is not. And one of the reasons for that is investor uncertainty about the mining industry. Just to give you one example about how important copper is, if you take a wind turbine, which is obviously very critical for the green energy transition, a 3.6 megawatt wind turbine contains nearly 29 tons of copper. At the moment, there is a 2/3 gap between current production rates and future demand for minerals needed for the green energy transition. And actually, the work that's been done indicates that graphite, lithium, and cobalt production could increase by 500% by 2050 to meet the growing demand for clean energy minerals. And when it comes to copper, we're obviously dealing, and it's a bit of a seesaw, but we're dealing with a copper price which on the 4th of March peaked at a price, I know it's down recently, of $10,797 a ton. So I mean, the benefits for Zambia of this green energy transition, given the fact that it's sitting with the second biggest treasure trove of these minerals in a much more politically stable and let me say it, democratic administration than the DRC, is extremely important. But having said all of that, the key elements for mining investment in any jurisdiction, and I've done a lot of work around East Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa, and my own country, South Africa, is you have to have a fair, predictable, and stable regulatory environment. In fact, all the research shows that after geology, regulatory certainty and predictability is the number 2 requirement that investors look at. And I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that the environment in this country, particularly under the previous administration, was anything but that. But to be a bit more positive, I mean, the government, the new administration, or as it's known in Zambia, the New Dawn administration, has done some good things around mining already. One is it's reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 30%. It's removed the non-deductibility of royalties from corporate income tax. And it's also indicated it's now going to operationalize the Mining Appeals Tribunal. Those are all important steps, but I think much more needs to be done. And I think I can give you one example. Copper output at the beginning of 2022, in other words, this quarter, is weaker than the production in the first quarter of 2021. And that's the time the copper price is going up. And to make another point, the Fraser Institute, which comes out every year in advance of PDAC, which is the biggest global mining conference in the world, it takes place in Toronto in March. This year it's going to be in June, and I normally attend it, said in relation to Zambia, and Zambia didn't get a very good score, that the permitting approval process, and I'm just quoting from them, this is not something I'm saying, was susceptible or permeated by political corruption, and the bureaucratic bottlenecks experienced in the permit approval process were a serious issue. And that is obviously concerning to investors. And I think the Ministry of Mines in this country, now under the new administration, recognizes this, because in February, i.e. last month, it imposed a 1-month moratorium subject to further extensions on the issuing of mining licenses. And that is, on the ministry's own admission, that is as a result of endemic corruption in the Mining Cadastre Office. And that is the body that's responsible for processing licenses. So if I could just talk about that very briefly. Zambia has a fairly modern mining code, the Mines and Minerals Act of 2015. And if you apply for a license, a lot of the mining code reflects international best practice. It goes to this Directorate of Mining Cadastre. It is then subject to review by a mining licensing committee, which has got to look at all the technical requirements for the grant of a license. And the committee, and again, this is international best practice, has to grant or refuse that license within 90 days. But the problem is there are a lot of governance issues in the way this committee operates. It's not clear when the committee reviews a licensing application whether this 90-day deadline is suspended while the committee investigates a particular application. So it may be that the time limit doesn't mean what it says. The other problem I have with the mining code is it vests very wide-ranging powers in the licensing committees around the review of mining licenses, and the criteria which it applies are rather vaguely stated. So the problem is, and this is always an issue in any mining jurisdiction, is the criteria are fairly vague and fluid, and there's a high level of administrative discretion given to the mining licensing committee. That, ladies and gentlemen, is always a problem. Discretion, wide, unbound administrative discretion is always a problem for mining investors. So, my take on all of this, and I appreciate time is limited, if you look at what the OECD has said around mining and public powers, the key elements to have, the key criteria to follow for good governance are accountability, transparency, efficiency, effectiveness, responsiveness, and the rule of law. Public governance is absolutely essential for investors because that promotes trust, the sort of thing that Sheila was talking about, between investors and host states. Predictability is essential for mining investors because that enables them to know when they apply for a license whether and when it will be granted. And another factor is the quality of the public service. And we've already seen this with the issues experienced here with the Mining Cadastre Office and the Licensing Committee, because the public service needs to be efficient, it needs to be effective, and needs to be responsive. The other point I would make is it's extremely important that one limits excessive administrative discretion as much as possible. And that's my point about the Mining License Committee. And to attract investors, Zambia has to have a system which is fair, transparent, timely, and efficiently administered, and removes opportunity for corruption, which you've already seen in terms of what the government has done. It's absolutely critical that the system promotes certainty as to when applicants are going to obtain rights, what they need to do when the rights need to be amended, renewed, or transferred, and that there are predictable outcomes. The other point I would make is that the mining code needs to contain a fair and objective dispute resolution mechanism so that investors again need to know what recourse they have in the event of a dispute. Do they have, for example, recourse to international arbitration? The other final point I would make about a mining code is the fiscal regime, and that's where Zambia has really struggled to deal with capturing resource rents effectively, because royalties in this country have seesawed in relation to the copper price. and the rules have changed inconsistently. Again, the OECD have suggested that there needs to be a fair sharing of financial benefits between the investor and the host state, taking into consideration the potential risks, rewards, and country circumstances, that there is no one ideal fiscal regime. Each host state needs to identify the optimal mix of fiscal instruments to meet its objectives. But the most important thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that the allocation of overall financial benefits between the host state and investors needs to reflect the variables that affect project profitability, such as commodity prices, costs, production volumes, and resource quality. And that in turn contributes to the long-term sustainability of extractive contracts and reduces the incentives for either party to seek renegotiation. So just in conclusion, I just want to touch on one point. I've been working in Saudi Arabia for the last 2 years, helping the kingdom with its mineral law reform program. And one of the things we did there, working with the World Bank, was ensuring, and we basically revamped the mining code, that the new law, which came into force at the beginning of last year, contains clear and objective requirements for the grant of rights, whatever right you're applying for, whether it's an exploration right or a mining license, that the discretion given to the ministry is limited to objective criteria, that there is an opportunity, and that doesn't exist in Zambia at the moment, or doesn't seem to remedy any defect in a defective application for a license, and that there are strict time limits for the making of decisions. I think, in conclusion, that if Zambia follows those sorts of best practice models by introducing, and this is a great opportunity for this administration, having only come into office in August, business-friendly policies which reform the legislative and regulatory regime, Zambia will increase investor confidence, it will drive investment in new mines, it will drive exploration in copper and cobalt, and it could drastically grow exports for the minerals which are absolutely essential for the green energy economy. And I think this could be a wonderful opportunity for Zambia. So thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much. Some really important issues and some lessons and recommendations for our hosts here in Zambia. And picking up also on what Sheila was saying, I think it's clear that there needs to be regulatory certainty, predictability, building that credible commitment between governments and companies, building trust between companies, governments, and social stakeholders and communities, outlining some of the positives and some of the lessons and some of what needs to be done around issues of tax, dispute resolution, licensing, but this really key point on limiting the excessive administrative discretion. And I'm sure that that's something that we'll come back to with Ian's presentation later on. This is a global conversation. We have people joining from all around the world today as part of this conference. I encourage you online to submit your questions to us, to the panel, and we will come to those soon. And our next speaker is going to talk to some of these global issues on the issue of global politics of rare earth mineral demand and strategic minerals. And our next speaker is Farai Nyambareka, who is a partner at Manokori Attorneys, which is a Zimbabwe-based DLA Piper Africa member firm working across various corporate practice groups and specifically on regulatory issues and compliance in mining and energy. Farai herself has extensive experience in dealing with regulatory issues, and she's highly experienced in providing corporate structure advice for a variety of local and international clients. And I'm hoping that she's going to share some of that advice that she has for her clients here with us today. So Farai, please. Thank you very much.
This has to be adjusted. Should be good. Firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Chatham House for the kind invitation and allowing me to present to this audience and share my contributions to this session. My topic and presentation is on the global politics of rare earth mineral demand. So, rare earth elements, what are they? There are 17 rare earth elements, and I won't bore you all with the details and citation of each and every one of them. However, despite the misnomer, while more abundant than many other minerals, rare earth elements are, however, not concentrated enough to make them economically viable and exploitable. So this is in the case unless labor costs are low or supported by state subsidies, such as in the instance of China. Additionally, detrimental effects on the environment, i.e. leaking of toxins into the water table, and health issues generated by the beneficiation and refining processes make it a challenging proposition. Some of the major end uses of rare earth elements include use in automatic catalytic converters, used in the making of medical devices, rechargeable batteries, cell phones, magnets, fluorescent lighting. They also play a large role in national defense industries, in the making of precision-guided weapons, GPS equipment, military applications, as guidance and control, targeted and weapon systems, communication platforms, fluid cracking catalysts in petroleum refining, amongst a number of other uses. So as we can see and appreciate, all of this is specifically concentrated with high-tech industries. So because of their use in the bar-cited products, global demand for rare earth elements has increased exponentially in alignment with the shift in the global production and trade policies. Why is there an increased demand, is the next question. Due to clean energy transitions and as groundbreaking technology inventions become embedded as the basis and catalyst for increased geo-economic competition, together with increased national security concerns across the world, the solidifying of supply chains for rare earths therefore become a global strategic issue. Further, due to the fact that China, which has now become a dominant supplier of rare earths with a monopoly, and coupled with the exposed vulnerability of global supply chains, such as evidenced by COVID-19, has brought the fragility of the world supply chain into sharp focus and into this international spotlight. This has perpetuated discussions on how best to guide global supply chain resilience. A lot of deployed regulation and policies taken, for example, by Japan, United States, and China highlight the critical aspect of strengthening supply chains of rare earth minerals on the back of geopolitical factors. For instance, global powers will be asking, firstly, how essential rare earth minerals are to its national security and economical interests, and secondly, if they're susceptible to supply disruptions and monopolies based on trade positions that may be adopted by political foes. Logically, the demand for rare earth elements is derived from the production of their end-use products, and therefore the demand for REEs, as with other minerals, depends on the strength of the demand for the end product. Therefore, invariably, the rate and strength of industrialization by each global power will determine its demand for rare earth minerals. So some statistics on production and reserves, and just an outline of who the key players currently are. Major reserves for rare earths exist in countries like the United States, Australia, and Brazil. However, China accounts for over 80% of rare earth element production in the world and controls around 30% of the world's reserves, which are estimated currently at about 99 million tons. According to a global supply chain report by Mark Humphreys, which was conducted in 2013, most REs throughout the world are located in deposits of the minerals bastnäsite and monazite. Bastnäsite deposits in the United States and China account for the largest concentration of rare earth elements, while monazite deposits in Australia, China, South Africa, Brazil, Malaysia, and India account for the largest concentrations of second largest concentrations of REEs. To contextualize the rapid shift in global political production dynamics, whilst the United States was able to produce and meet its own demand for rare earths in the 1990s, there has been a concentrated shift in that the United States is now almost 100% reliant on China for rare earths import. China has been able to emerge as a dominant force and leading producer and exporter due to a number of interventions introduced in the early 2000s. namely introduction of resource tax, an increased production quota coupled with a reduced export quota and state-assisted stockpiling production policies. They've essentially made stockpiling of rare earths a commercial reserve policy. To date, China remains the leading force on REEs, extraction expertise, with the right production and distribution mix and established industry. Focus will now turn to examples of how rare earth supply is a viable geopolitical tool in response to political tensions between nations. In 2010, China placed an unofficial and temporary embargo of rare earth shipments to Japan aimed at its automobile industry following a diplomatic dispute. In March 2012, the Obama administration announced the filing of a World Trade Organization case against China, citing unfair trade policies in rare earths. More recently, in January 2021, the Chinese government released a draft bill requiring companies to follow controls and regulations for the import and export of rare earth, an extension of policies aimed to prohibit the export of Chinese technology that could be diverted for military use. Therefore, there's an established hostile trade environment and a propensity between various nations where a nation seeks to strengthen and leverage its negotiation position. It is evident, therefore, that there's a juxtaposition between politics and rare earth industrial and trade policies, which ultimately have a greater impact on trade flows and supply chain security more than, in fact, any physical disruptions. So the question is, what is the emergence of Africa and how can it play a role in shaping the global REE landscape? On account of the fact that rare earths are embedded in most high-tech products, it follows that demand will continue to increase in parallel amongst global industrialized nations and superpowers. This presents a unique opportunity for Africa to position itself. A 2011 paper by Jean Baker titled Mining Exploitation of Rare Earth Elements as an Engagement Strategy in US stated, there's an increased recognition that parts of sub-Saharan Africa offer the greatest potential for rare earth production, which could eventually align the ongoing market imbalance and reduce monopolies and supply fragility. Specifically, a number of southern and eastern African countries have been cited as having high-graded large deposits of rare earth minerals to make mining exploitation economically feasible and provide their governments and people with new economic opportunities. The cited countries include Namibia, South Africa, Kenya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Burundi, which in those jurisdictions at present, there are various of several active projects, all involving multinational companies, either in the prospective or early mining stages. Lastly, I'll just put forward the possible reasons why Africa is uniquely placed. Firstly, there's low labor cost, little to no environmental pressure, particularly from lobbying groups in the extraction phase. There is still gaps for big technological leaps and discoveries, particularly in the production stage, with a push for recycling. Young, fast-growing population, which will provide a ready-made market demand for domestic end products. There's an emerging trade policy positions and frameworks favorable to Africa, for example, COMESA and the strengthening of Africa Continental Free Trade Area amidst a fragmented EU and on the back of Brexit and a looming war. Lower industry base, which presents an opportunity for exponential growth in domestic production. And lastly, Africa is not hamstrung in rife geopolitical tensions, unlike other superpowers who are jockeying for positions. So it is not hampered and is able to trade freely and establish greater supply chains with various regional and global markets. So in conclusion, there's been an adequate demonstration of how policy can help shape long-term global demand and supply, and the securing of and access to alternative sources of rare earth elements. I submit, Chair.
Farai, thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation, bringing it back up to that global level of pointing out that many rare earth deposits are not economically viable. The demand for rare earths is often concentrated in a few key manufacturing countries, but there is a strategic need for supply chain diversification, and where we've discussed policy and legislation and regulation, there is also a political and diplomatic element to some of these relationships and some key geopolitical considerations. Now, our next two speakers will be taking some of what we've heard at the global and regional level and discussing the industry and sector here in Zambia. I'm delighted to welcome to the stage next Ian Mwinga, who is the National Coordinator of the Zambia Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, that's the EITI. And he also represents the Anglophone region of the EITI, the International Board, and serves as the co-chairperson for the Implementation Committee on the EITI board. I also know the EITI have been doing a considerable amount of work here in Zambia, including discussing these issues across multiple stakeholders. And so very much welcome your remarks here today and drawing on your own work and the work of your organization on this here in Zambia. So please.
Thanks a lot for the generous introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I can see right at the back the team from the Chamber of Mines. I was looking for you, I said, where is this team? But sadly, I think we are missing a very critical stakeholder, which is the government. And I was asking myself while I seated there, I said, what am I doing here? Because exactly the discussion that we are having this afternoon is the discussion that we have in the ministerial boardroom. And so I think the value of the government being present here would have been extremely important. But just to mention also that one needs probably to understand the psychology, the internal psychology of the government now, is that everything being discussed is about the debt. I remember one time reporting back from an AITI conference, talking about, we are supposed to disclose beneficial owners of companies. And then it was like, how is this going to reduce the debt? So a discussion of this nature has to be put in a context. And the context now is that the government is in a debt mode, a mode to look for solutions to reduce the debt. Anything that comes is second priority. And that is why, if you remember very well, I think it was last year, there was actually a huge discovery of gold deposits across the country, and I think up to now. And immediately, the government moved in to declare gold a strategic mineral. And that was it. The discussion around critical minerals hasn't really taken a foothold. And I think this is an indication very clearly of a need to support the government to begin to think critically and also probably strategically. Coming from the EITI, we represent the three stakeholders. That's the government, civil society, and also the mining sector, which colleagues from the Chamber of Mines represent. But then, listening through the conversations, one begins to think, perhaps we are expecting a little bit too much too early from the government without any supporting structures in terms of even as basic as understanding what these critical minerals are all about. We have seen, for example, in the EITI fraternity, Uganda signing a $10 billion investment in the fossil fuel. And then we ask ourselves, was there any consideration about the green critical minerals and the future of energy going forward? We have also seen, and we still continue to see, a lot of demand from the communities in terms of corporate social responsibility, partly driven by the legacy of ZCCM. And so the private sector, as we heard earlier, they've got an objective. When they come to invest they've got their own a list of things to achieve. But that is astronomically extremely difficult to explain in the community. And from the EITI perspective, we have tried our best to disclose the figures, but who loves figures? When you go in the community to go and explain these figures, for instance, First Quantum and Kalumbila jointly spent $7 million in 2020. And then you go to these communities, tell them $7 million was spent by these two companies, say, you must be kidding me. $7 million should have left a crater in our areas. How do you just explain? And this actually tries to demonstrate the challenges that we have in this space. The critical minerals space, including the strategic minerals space, has probably come a bit too soon for most countries, but also it has come with a lot of force, with a lot of information. Now, I was just listening earlier on to Mr. Shitima, where now you begin to see the linkages between this space of critical minerals and climate change for the benefit of not only the region, the African region, but a global region. And so that moves you in issues of, do we have as a country, for example, Zambia, an energy transition policy? I asked that question. I think he didn't, Mr. Shitima didn't get that. But for us to move in a direction that is desired, a direction that is probably a bit more organized, we need all these instruments. The regulation, if you look at our Environmental Protection Fund as a country, the fund is sitting around $32 million US. But that fund, if you look at the list of companies contributing to that fund, it's just a paltry. Where is everybody else? And yet we are talking about these environmental risks and also the future of mining. The other thing that I need to mention is around the policies in the mining sector. There is no need to design and have new policies. The policies that we have, if you look through the mining code, you look at the various laws that also complement that, we do have a very rich collection as a country. But where is the problem? The issues around the fiscal regime. We had an Indaba, was it last year or the year before, where all the stakeholders came on board and listed the problems, the challenges, the needs for the industry. We have those, but where is the problem? Where do we need to twitch? And I think for me, that is a point of reflection that we need to do. Probably the most important thing for the EITI, forgive me for my biases, is the issue of disclosure. Currently, the company's legislation, for Zambia, it has a requirement for disclosure of beneficial ownership. And I think one of the speakers mentioned about the self-confessed corruption in the mining sector. That information is there. It's not a secret. And all this information has been disclosed by the EITI for a number of years. We still have companies that underdeclare their exports. This information is disclosed in the reports. And when you look at these trends happening, one would literally not even blame the companies, because the penalty units for an underdeclaration are just literally peanuts. As a CEO, I can plan at the beginning of the year to literally underdeclare my exports. And so these are the systematic issues that we are hoping the data that we are disclosing through the EITI can begin to bring in what is the role of data in mining policy formulation, but also not just data for, it should be data that actually leads to something. And the disclosure for us is extremely important to get the production figures correct. If a mine, for example, Kansanshi discloses their production figures, does the government have the same numbers? And we move on to the next notch also to bring that data into the public domain. There's nothing secret about this information. This information is very, very vital. So I thought of just reflecting on some of the key issues that are currently being considered internally without repeating what has been captured by my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you very much. Very useful comments there, particularly on tying into our conversation on critical minerals and climate change, need for transition policy, where will the energy for processing these come from? Also, on the debate on whether or not there needs to be a new policy, and bringing to the fore issues around the fiscal regime, disclosure, declaration, and the important role that EITI and others play in holding companies and government to account through improved sharing of data. Our final speaker is joining us online and is joining us from Scotland, I believe, and that's Anthony Mukutuma, who is the general manager at Kansanshi Mine, which is First Quantum Minerals owned mine here in Zambia. I believe is the first Zambian to be the general manager of that mine, which is in itself a commendable accolade. But in his position here today, he's going to share with us some of his views and some of the company views on what is being done in terms of environmental management and what is being done in terms of the relationship with the communities. So, Antti, I'm delighted that you're able to join us here today from Scotland. I apologize for breaking up your holiday and bringing you into this discussion, but thank you for joining us, and we very much look forward to what you have to share. Thank you. Anthony, are you able to hear us? Okay, Anthony, it appears we're just trying to sort out your audio feed so that we can hear you as well as see your presentation. That's his screen. Anthony, we can see your screen, but we can't hear you. Okay, while we try and connect through to Anthony's audio, perhaps we'll start with a Q&A discussion with the panelists that we have here. And once we get through to Anthony, we'll hear his presentation on sustainable mining. So we move into the Q&A. I think we've heard some really great material here this afternoon at a global level, at a regional level, and at a national level of what some of the key issues are within the mining sector and what some of the key discussion points are. So who is going to be the first one to raise their hand and ask a question? Yes, sir, please. At the back, do we have a microphone? Yep. I think the gentleman at the back in the white shirt. Please remember to introduce yourself, let us know who you are, and tell us your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Mtwalo Msoni, currently a consultant with a number of civil society organizations working around economic policy in Africa. I think I want to recognize that Ian mentioned something that's very critical, which is the question of whether we require a policy at this point on the energy transition. Farai, in her presentation, highlighted clearly that the mineral endowments, when you look at strategic minerals, rare earth minerals, you look at them from a regional perspective. And it was earlier highlighted that in the case for cobalt and copper, Zambia and DRC share most of the reserves. So I think the question at this point is whether at this point we want to relook at what exists in terms of a regional policy guide, the African Mining Vision, the African Minerals Governance Framework, which both do not present any position for the African continent on strategic minerals or climate change. Do we want to look at those first of all and see if we need to develop a regional strategy for harnessing the potential that these rare earth minerals come with? And if we're going to look at this, what exactly should we be targeting? Should we be targeting things to do with the fiscal aspects? DRC increased mineral royalties for cobalt to 10% following the boom in cobalt prices. Zambia followed suit, increasing cobalt royalties. So do we want to target royalties? Do we want to target something on incentives on geology to understand what we have? What exactly do we need to do to have the right line of investors on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions in the room? Otherwise, I've got one from online, and I believe, yes, we've got two in the front here, so we'll go for Brenda, then Moses, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Chanda. I'm a partner in the law firm Moira Mkuka Legal Practitioners. I'll just quote something that our president, His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, said when he was meeting a delegation. When he was meeting a delegation led by the finance minister from the Democratic Republic of Zambia, and I quote, DRC and Zambia hold more than 70% of the world's cobalt and copper reserves, and yet, despite this mineral value chain, the two countries only capture 3% of the global battery and battery electric vehicle value chain. And he made a statement saying that this will change. I just want to throw this question to the panel. What, in your view, needs to happen for this move from, not benefiting from the mineral value chain, changing from where it is to where the president, the two countries of Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo want to see it? What strategic decisions and positions need to be taken? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we have one more from Moses, please introduce yourself for those who don't know.
I'm Moses Banda. I'm from Kalahari Geoenergy. We are geothermal explorers. My question is directed at Ian. He had said that when gold was discovered about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of excitement in Zambia. But the public reaction was that, no, it has to be mined and owned by Zambians. But the question is, that promotion of that nationalistic narrative make the mineral disappear? And the second question is for Peter Leon. Peter Leon, when we move in the region looking for assets, we find sometimes we find restrictions. Like in Zimbabwe, they say you have 51% should be owned by the indigenous people or the local people based in Zimbabwe. But don't you find that these restrictions on ownership discourage investment? Thank you.
Moses, thank you very much. So I think we've got a question for Farai on regional policy and do we want a regional strategy on strategic minerals, and if so, on what? A question for Peter on what needs to happen to move to benefiting more from mineral value chains, and then a question for Ian on Zambian ownership and investor sentiment. So perhaps Farai first, you can. Could we have her microphone on, please?
Thank you for the question. I believe, to recap, the question is, do we need a regional policy in order to get maximum benefits from strategic minerals? In my view, I think a pragmatic approach needs to be taken. Earlier on in the presentations, when we were discussing the dynamics of having a regional policy, particularly in the infrastructure space, there's obviously been an exploration of where challenges come in adopting from the get-go a region-wide approach to a strategy, specifically when it comes to minerals. It's a bit of a different dynamic. In the first place, we don't know what we have, especially when it comes to our EEs. I believe that these are significantly and massively underexplored. So, and I gave an example of where they occur across the African continent. And as you can appreciate, this is quite widespread. So at this juncture, my view is that a regional approach will be premature until governments themselves have actually made a direct effort to ascertain what we have. When we have established that, I think the next step is to actually then get into the dynamics of how do we explore this within the national borders of where the resource is found, establishing key linkages, and firstly, I think being able to put forward an active production line. And then when we have that in place, I think we can move on to a more regional focus as to how then that's best exploited for the greater good of the continent in the different blocks.
Thanks, Brian. Peter, take yours.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very good question from Brenda. The answer partly lies in the African Mining Vision, which recognized this in 2009, but obviously it is quite out of date, and it does need some updating. And actually, the question asked to Farai, one of the issues there is, does the AMV not need to be updated in light of the green energy transition, which I don't think is really taken any account of. But what the African Mining Vision tried to do back then is to say to African mining jurisdictions that you need to do much more around beneficiation, downstream, upstream, and side stream, and create all these linkages. My sense, though, is not a lot of that has simply not happened. Beneficiation is expensive. It is energy intensive, and it requires quite a lot of technical and technological skills. But I mean, it's a very good point made by the president. Why is it that the DRC and Zambia are getting so little out of the mineral value chain, and shouldn't more be going on in these particular countries? But I mean, if you look at what it costs to build a smelter or refinery, the capital costs are enormous. And I think one of the reasons some mining companies have stayed away from that is around fiscal or regulatory uncertainty. They haven't known whether or not it's worthwhile making those investments. If I can also just abuse the occasion just to make one comment in relation to Moses' question about ownership. That's one of the issues we looked at in Saudi Arabia, and the government's view was, other than establishing a local company to apply for a license, there's absolutely no requirement for any local ownership, because they saw that as a hindrance to investment. If you actually look at what's happened in South Africa with the mining charter and black economic empowerment, where the requirements have gone from 26% to 30% in the last 5 years, there's less and less new investment into the South African mining industry for that very reason, and less exploration expenditure. And if you don't have exploration, you're not going to have production, as you well know, Moses. So I think that's one point I would make. I would think you need to be very careful about local ownership requirements, where actually, if you look at the DRC, the requirements are extremely onerous now.
Ian, if you take that, and then I believe we've got Anthony back online. So you take your question, and then we'll go.
Just a quick comment on the issue of gold. I think we've seen a plethora of gold discoveries across the country. And I think from the government side, there's been some movement in terms of the purchases and also the agreements with the big mines, concession with the central bank. But I think there is need to have more in terms of supporting, for example, the ASM sector. And I think for Zambia, the biggest gap has been, the mentorship from the large-scale mines because of the problems with the issues of trust and other factors in the sector. So I think it's an appeal to the team from Chamber of Mines also to actually step up to the plate in terms of mentoring the ASM, especially in the gold space, because as it is now, even the mining methods being used and the safety and environmental issues are quite glaring. So that would be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. So I believe we're going to be able to now go for Anthony's presentation. So if we can unmute Anthony and give him permission to share his screen, share his slides, and deliver his presentation for us here this afternoon. Anthony, can you hear us now? Good. And can we hear you?
You can hear me, can you?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I'll share my screen quickly. Yeah, could you let me know when you can see that screen, please?
We can see your screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. So I'll continue on the subject of strategic minerals, and I'm focusing mainly on environmental sustainability in the mining industry. And simply put, I'll be talking about sustainable mining. What does that look like? It is clear, based on the evidence so far and even discussions today, that the green economy will drive much higher demand for minerals than ever seen in the history of mankind. I was listening to a conference this morning that's taking place in Chile, and there was sentiment that was expressed there that with the green economy coming up, the demand for copper is going to be of a magnitude higher than what's been mined since the 1400 going forward. So, and that has to be mined in the next 25 years. So that's significant, and that shift to the green economy is mainly driven by the fact that the materials required on a different scale in terms of demand of initial investment. Now, for example, an electric vehicle requires 6 times the minerals input compared to its fossil fuel counterpart. So that's many magnitudes higher. If you look at the critical minerals going forward, you will see that in terms of lithium, from a demand of almost 0% into the energy sector back in 2010, that has grown to about 90%. That's estimated to grow to about 90% by about 2040. The trends on cobalt and copper are also similar. Cobalt was 0% into the energy sector in 2010, and that's forecast to grow to about 70% by 2040. Nickel, similar, 3% in 2010, up to 62% by 2040. That's the forecast. And copper as well, 21% a few years ago in 2010, and it's up at about 43%. On the rare earth side, you see the demand was about 13% going into the energy sector back in 2010, and that has grown to, that is forecast to grow to about 40% by 2040. So it is clear that the energy sector will become a leading consumer of minerals as the energy transitions accelerate. What does that mean for mining? What that means is that mining is critical to the green revolution. Now, the transition to green energy is predicated on sustained mining growth. Demand for the critical materials will increase up to tenfold, and therefore mining activity will also increase to the same scale. This demand in minerals and coupled with decreasing ore grades points to larger mining operations going forward. And larger mining operations mean larger disturbances and higher land usage. It also means larger impacts on and more visibility of mining operations to host communities. It also means a higher pull on water, energy, and resources. There's also, that increase also comes with higher emissions that require greater attention to mitigation through efficiency improvements and/or technology. Finally, and probably most importantly, that increase in mining operations means that there's going to be a larger base of dynamic and well-informed stakeholders that require a shift in relationship from just observers and commentators to partners with a seat at the decision-making tables of mining companies and government policymakers. Now, mining companies have to realize that with that growth comes a shift. It is not going to be business as usual for any mining company, and it will never be again, clearly, from what we're seeing. Most major mining companies understand this and are acting. There's a much stronger focus on ESG, and ESG has to become center and forefront for mining to be sustainable at the scale that the future is predicting. I'll just go through a few slides just to show how we are managing this as First Quantum in Zambia and in the other countries where we operate. So what we find is that as we focus on actually increased focus on ESG, the first thing that we see is primarily important is a focus on respect and trust. That's maintaining an open dialogue and working in collaboration with our host communities. The second point is around high standards. That's a recognition that the environmental and social impacts of mining requires a deliberate focus on continuous improvement. And that's something that we've been working on as a mining company. Third point is collaboration on enablers and critical matters, working with host governments and communities on greater protection of biodiversity and enhanced public infrastructure and improved education and healthcare. Also a focus on making sure that the challenge of climate change is seeing action that guarantees real change. And also going forward, that any projects that we do engage in focus on making sure that these meet higher standards in terms of environmental and social impacts. With this approach, we've been able to see our projects start to thrive in the countries where we operate, particularly with the bigger mines that we have in Zambia and in Cobre Panama. And this is the approach that we intend to apply to the bigger projects that are coming up out in Takataka and in Hakira. I'll just go to the next slide and just show what that actually looks like in reality. So there's 4 points that I'll cover quickly. It's greenhouse gases reduction, tailings management, and water use, and community engagement. So on the greenhouse gases side, what we've done is gone quite strongly into making sure that our mining equipment is hooked up onto electricity, and making sure that we begin to move away from the use of diesel in the mining fleet. So we've got what we call the trolley assist, which is what you saw in the picture earlier. That is the trucks that are running on electric. And that's been extended also into in-pit crushing and conveying, and electric drills and electric shovels as well. So all that conversion of mining equipment onto electric from diesel has occurred on our sites over the last 12 years, and it's something that we continue to work on. So our trucks and other mining equipment at Kansanshi and Sentinel and Panama is all set up to be running on electric. And the more investment we do onto new trucks, we are actually phasing out all that equipment that was running on diesel in the past. A further point on this front is an investment in renewable energy generation. And this is with regard to a project that we're currently working on solar and wind in Zambia, and also a commitment to transition from coal power in Panama onto hydropower, and also solar and wind. So what we've seen there is reportedly up to the report of 2021 is a reduction of about 100,000 tons of CO2 emissions. So that's the sort of standard that we aspire to, and that's the sort of standard that the larger mines that the future is calling for, we will have to work towards. The other key point is around our tailings dams and our tailings management. So making sure that those are operated and designed to international standards and guidelines, and making sure that there's a governance structure over the tailings dam in terms of how they are managed, and how they are audited, and how there's oversight in making sure that there's continuous improvement in that space as well. On the water use side, there's a big focus on making sure that we cut down on freshwater draws into the operations. And that's been a big focus. And you will see on the charts on your left that the water reuse, which is a major focus for us, is very high, is over 70% on our larger mines, and slightly lower on our smaller mines where water tends to be more abundant. But really the focus is, as the operations grow to the size of Cobre Panama or Kansanshi or Sentinel, that scale, running anything from 50 to about 150 million tons per year, that it's important that water use is center and forefront of every considerations that we put across. My last point is just around the community. Like I said, our stakeholders are becoming more diverse, and they need to have a say, because the larger mines tend to have a bigger disturbance, and people then have to be moved and people have to be managed. So it's important that there's engagement with the communities, that anything that's done in that space has the engagement of every single stakeholder, whether it be the traditional leaders, the community-based groups, and other stakeholders in the communities. As First Quantum, we've been able to develop these partnerships, and some of them work very well, and some of them are work in progress. But as a result of that, we've been able to inform some of our CSR work and make sure that we are relevant, and the projects that we embark on have the backing of the communities that are the beneficiaries of anything we do. I'll just end with a quotation that came up in the Mining 2030 from the Church of England Ngawat Pensions Board, which really agrees with the point that mining is critical for the green economy going forward. And good practice and leadership exists in the mining space, but it's just not pervasive. It's something that we have to focus on to make sure that there's leadership through a bigger body, the chambers of commerce and the chambers of mines around the world, and bodies like the EITI, that there's leadership and these practices can go wider in the mining space than just a few Ngawat isolated cases of good practice. So I'll stop there, Chair, and I'll invite any questions from the audience.
Anthony, thank you very much. I will take a round of questions from the audience. I know that there are people who have questions, both for the panel and for Anthony. But perhaps I will ask one of Anthony myself first. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for highlighting the importance of the work that FQM is doing with regards to community engagement in particular. I wanted to ask a question with regards to the frameworks and the mechanisms for that that govern that community engagement on both economic and environmental issues. Are these externally defined and developed frameworks that you apply and implement as a company, or are these frameworks and mechanisms that you have come up with yourself? And are these, do you think, are there lessons and are these replicable for other examples as well?
Okay, thank you, Chris. Do you want me to answer that now, or do you want to wait for another question?
Please, if you answer that now, and then we'll take a round from the floor. I want to capitalize on having the link secure to you first.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So the framework that we use is, we actually get context from group, but then the local leadership team, myself at Kansanshi and my colleague out at our other mine in Trident, we would then take that context and apply it to what is pertaining in the local context or in the local community where we operate. So that means getting into a room with the traditional leaders, with the what members of parliament, with local groups, and really listening to them and candidly being open about what matters for them, and also what matters to the mining company. And what we found is that by having that local engagement being the final say of what actually happens, is that we've been a lot more effective. I worked previously for a different mining company where context for social work came from head office. And then what you get into is a situation where you are driving projects that are not relevant or not the immediate needs in the community. So yeah, it's context from group, but the actual projects are decided at a local level. That makes them a lot more relevant and a lot more tailored to the local community. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much. I'll take another round of questions from the floor before we move to our next session. So I've got 2 hands here. We'll go for the gentleman in front first, and then the gentleman behind. Anybody else, if you do have a question, once I've taken those 2, raise your hands. This will be the last round of questions for this session. But please, we've heard from you before, but please do also reintroduce yourself for those who have just tuned in online for this session.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. My name is Andrew Mwava. I'm a private citizen. I wanted to come back to this issue of ownership. How should I put it? Okay, Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. My name is Andrew Mwava. I'm a private citizen. I wanted to come back to this issue of ownership. You know, we have talked about the fiscal regime and having a correct fiscal regime and so forth. But you see, a good fiscal regime is a sufficient but not, is a necessary condition but not sufficient for a country to maximize revenues from its mines. We have to look at the issue of ownership. Ownership by local actors, including the government, local financial institutions, and private Zambian investors, is key. At the minimum, you get an additional stream of revenues from dividends. But if you do not have any stake in the mines, you will not get dividends. You will just get taxes, which may come from underreported profits. So my point is that if you are to get anything from the mines, there has to be ownership. This ownership is not coerced, like Dr. Banda was saying. This is ownership which can come about by market interaction. Most countries which have benefited from their mines have done this because of joint ventures. You have to have joint ventures with foreign investors. You cannot give them 100% ownership. The joint ventures can start from the beginning. Some countries encourage ownership from exploration. You are exploring with the foreign investors on an equal basis. By the time the mines are maturing, you are co-owners. I think Botswana gives us the best example with diamonds. In Botswana, the government owns 50% of the stake, and the bears the other 50%. This is something which gives Botswana additional income streams from dividends made by the company, as well as dividends made by individuals. So I think for me, ownership is key. We have to look at it. The fiscal regime is not sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment there on joint ventures and PPPs as ways of sharing benefit. We'll take the question from the gentleman behind in the white shirt, and then we'll take a comment from over here.
Thank you. My name is Tembo Charles, and member of the Common Futures Conversation. I think my question arises on the matter. We had a debate in Zambia recently in terms of mining in the lower Zambezi, which was a very big debate between mining industry and also looking into issues of the environmental sector, and then also to deal with areas that are primarily water natural bodies in Zambia and Southern Africa, and then also issues to deal with national parks. What is your key comment on such an issue where we have these natural bodies in Zambia and then also interest of mining are key concerns? I would like to find out more on these key issues.
Great, thank you very much. I'll put that question to the panel. It's a specific question around the Lower Zambezi, I believe, but more broadly around kind of land use options between mining and conservation and where that sits. Before I put that question to the panel and give them a chance to make a final statement to wrap up the session, I'm going to hand the floor to the representatives from the Zambian Chamber of Mines. At the back there, we've got President Dr. Godwin Bean and CEO Sokwani Chilembo, and I believe we'll have a statement from the Chamber. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. I hope you can hear us. I just want to make a broad comment. So we came a bit late in the afternoon, but then we came at the right time. But this is essentially our show. We are miners. My dear friends, I think with respect to value addition, which is quite a hot issue, and sometimes that I believe can easily be misunderstood. I think let's put it this way. In this country, let the miner mine, because that's what he knows. So let him get all the investment he can get from wherever he gets it, but let him mine. His job is to mine properly, responsibly, as we heard Anthony Mukutuma say. Let him do his job. Anyone who wants his product, pick it from him at the gate. Nobody will stop you from doing that. But let the miner mine. I don't think many people in this room and many people in Zambia would be in a position, as we speak now, to actually start and operate a mine. Let's just be very frank. So let the people who know the business of mining, whether it's open pit or underground, doesn't matter where they come from, let them do the job. Now, those of us who are concerned about value addition, let us pick it from where they stop, which means we take a bottom-up approach, which means we must be aware of what products are made from base metals, for example. We have been talking about energy, material inputs into energy. Let us know what we can make, the quality, the demand, and for me, more importantly, in this country, the enablers, which is fiscal regime, is an enabler to anybody who wants to go into value addition. Energy itself. Because if we don't have power in this country, then you can't really talk much about doing things that people that we sell copper to overseas do. If our skills are not there, you can't talk about doing these things that other people also do. And finally, infrastructure. If it's absent, then again, we are not fulfilling what it takes to do complete value addition. So let's take it ourselves as those who want to do value addition bottom up. Let the miners do their job. They will give us quality product. You have no problem. Okay, Zamefa is attest to that because they take our local electro one cathode and they do a good job. Let's pick it from there. Whether you want to make anything else from copper, pick it from there. But then we must then ourselves now engage with whoever it is that will enable us effect value addition. Because I hear very often we Zambians cry that we are not getting much from mining, we are not mining, we can do this, we can do that. Oh, that's good, but I think let's take it from where we are able ourselves to run. Let the miners do their job. They will mine it, they will invest big time, they will mine it responsibly, and then we pick it up. But I think over and above this, perhaps Chilembo could just add two more comments on base of what we've been hearing this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Like we said, this is a general comment that will try and address several of the issues that have arisen in the discussions that we've heard thus far. I'll pick up from where Dr. Bene has left off in terms of our local circumstance. There's been a question around benefiting from our endowment, and I think we mustn't ignore the fact that we've had a very poor strategy in the very recent past and headed back quite far. This has changed under the New Dawn administration, with their putting mining front and center of their development agenda via the 3 million ton aspiration. As an industry, we've begun to make that more granular. We've had the geologists come through, give us an idea of what sort of time frame it would take to execute such an Herculean task. And it is something which we have to be resolved to do. And in being resolved to doing this, it is something we must be resolved to do profitably. And there are two structures to this. Above the line, you've got your taxes, you've got your infrastructure, and the value add benefits that we've spoken of now. And we've never even properly done these things because of our policy inconsistency. So first, as Dr. Bene has said, let's make it possible for miners to mine. Because if miners don't mine efficiently, nobody will want to come and make cables here anyway, because there will be no margin in doing so. You might as well maintain your factory close to market in the West and just buy off the open market. So we've got to get it right for the simple core business of mining first. And all the elements that are required to do so have been discussed exhaustively locally, as Ian had mentioned, via our local mining indabas and the exploration indaba recently. Now, below the line, with regard to local participation, we need to look at this much more broadly than just ownership. I mean, there's a whole industrial base that can be built from suppliers into our mining value chain. There is a whole financial services base that can be built from enabling capital market access from all players in the mining value chain, from explorers like Dr. Banda, to manufacturers, to miners themselves, to small-scale artisanal gold miners, as Ian had mentioned, by availing them access to capital and to these markets. And this can only begin to happen if you allow miners to go out, access capital for their primary function, and then catalyze the mobilization of complementary capital into these areas. If you lumber the miners with all these responsibilities, you end up with a repeat of the strategic errors that led us to where we are today. There's never been an opportunity to correct these mistakes at these prices and these demand profiles, but we must have a very structured approach to the same. And as is said quite often, we are very lucky. We have a country which has some government shareholding in the majority of the industry. So that's a place to start. So we're better off than a lot of places that have zero government participation. And what we need to do is to build on this by availing colleagues like Mr. Mwaba access to capital to become a player within the sector. Now, there were some questions around the regional harmonization opportunities. I serve as Vice President of the Mineral Industry Association of Southern Africa, so we can probably address a few of those as well. There is already a discussion afoot under the auspices of SADC in both the areas of strategic energy minerals and in terms of development of the regional value chain. And the key discussions there are obviously trying to do things in a manner that does not disadvantage any particular country. But some of the overarching issues that we are facing are really around how important the green opportunity is being weighed. We are aware, for example, that the EU has apportioned some funds to assist with primary exploration for minerals in Africa. But that as Zambia, we are actually a tier 2 country under this initiative, which really perplexes us, because if it is so important, then surely we must be a tier 1 opportunity. If the challenges that are, the historical challenges are what have led to this, I think there's a clear demonstration that the government is moving in the right direction for us to begin to deliver on our potential. And we really ought to be a tier one opportunity for providers of capital for exploration and primary exploration and the building of capacity within government like the EU. So for us, these are really, just like I said, some general comments. The discussions have begun. It's very early days yet, but I think the key thing here is we must not lose sight of the fact that previously we have compromised growth. Going forward, that is what we must ring fence. If we don't ring fence growth, then we'll repeat the errors of the past.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Godwin Bene and Sokwani Chilimbo, respectively, the President and the CEO of the Zambian Chamber of Mines. We have come to the end of the session. I'm going to invite the speakers perhaps just to give their final bullet point, their final full stop to their presentations and to the questions that they've heard, either in response to questions on land use, ownership, and what we've heard from the Chamber about, vertical and horizontal linkages depend upon the core business and getting the core business correct in the first place. So perhaps if we go in the order of the panel here, I hope we've still got Anthony online as well for his final statement. But Peter, perhaps if you give us your final point.
Yeah, I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate the input from the Chamber of Mines, and so I couldn't agree with them more. If I could just use this opportunity to answer quite an important question which was raised around ownership. I agree. I think the issue of ownership can be something of a red herring, because the issue is, and actually goes to the question asked by Brenda, how do you actually promote linkages to the industry? And you do that actually through procurement of goods and services, through creating local content requirements. And this fixation with ownership, to me, doesn't make a great deal of sense, particularly in Zambia already. You have ZCCM as a minority shareholder in many of the mining companies that are operating here. So it's not as though you're going here from a zero base. And I actually think it's a mistake to create hurdle rates for investors, which actually just simply increase the hurdle rate for an investment in any new project, and to require ownership requirements around exploration. Even South Africa, with all its ideology over black empowerment, even South Africa, the mining charter, has now got rid of that. So I think and really that's central to the message I was making this afternoon in my remarks. I mean, the key thing, particularly given Zambia's extraordinary resource endowment and its centrality to the green energy transition in Africa, the key thing for Zambia to be doing is to be encouraging investment into the mining industry and not creating hurdles to that investment. Once you get that investment, you're going to get new production. You will eventually meet the government's target of 3 million tons of copper, which is very ambitious over the next 10 years. So I think that is the key thing to look at around ownership and investment. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much. I think you've written the title for our next conference there on who holds responsibility for creating economic opportunities beyond the gate. And that's a huge question. Farai, please, your final point.
Thank you, Chris. I think mine is to just echo what the first speaker on our panel was speaking about. I think it was Sheila, I believe, who said that we as Africa are so reactionary when it comes to putting forth actual strategies and developing policies that will benefit and harness the potential that the resources we own have. We've obviously seen how RE is a strategic asset going forward, and where there's already been a scramble and a jockeying of positions by the superpowers, and I think it's really more of an imploring or a rallying call to all the stakeholders in the mining sector to say, this is here an opportunity that presents itself, and I think we just need to be the first to the draw to actually then contextualize and monetize how REs as they're shaped in the context of the clean energy transition and the opportunities for industrialization in high tech will bring about the next leap for African growth and sustained development.
Farai, thank you very much. A rallying call there from Farai. Ian, please.
Thanks. Just a quick comment on ownership. I think the current state of ZCCM Investment Holdings, in its current structure, it doesn't fit the purpose of probably what Dr. Banda you were talking about. There is need to restructure ZCCM IH, and there is need for the country to choose whether we need an investment holding or a state-owned enterprise. That should be clear. Because at the moment, if there's an impaired asset, like we saw for Mopani and at some point for Kolamco, it was unbundled onto ZCCM. I don't think there was any consideration with the capacity of ZCCM IH balance sheet to actually hold those assets in whatever form they were. The question around the options around land use, I think from the EITI, the comment is that we encourage the mine owners and the government to provide full disclosure of information. And I think that will help also build the trust that the Chamber of Mines team has mentioned. We have lost too much time arguing on small, probably not small, but probably peripheral issues. The fiscal regime in Zambia has taken all the space, and yet today we are hearing about local content and many other things that we can discuss. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and the Chamber of Mines and also for the government to bring us together, and also for civil society to be a key player in that role. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much. Anthony, are you still able to hear us and share your final comment with us?
Yes, thanks, Chris. I think my final comment is just around the question on mining in the Lower Zambezi, and I do concur with Mwinga that it is possible, but like I was saying earlier, to be able to manage the ESG issues that arise when you mine in a location like that is quite onerous. So it's something that government and stakeholders need to consider deeply before making the decision. And remember, once you get into mining, there's no turning back. So the decision has to be made upfront, and it needs to consider many views and make sure that it's measured. Thank you very much.
Very much. I'd like to thank our speakers here today. We had the video from Sheila Kama, and I again encourage you to watch the full video that is shared on that link on your agenda. And we thank Peter Leon, Farai Namareka, Ian Mwinga, and Anteli Mukutuma for their presentations and for being part of this discussion here today. So thank you very much.